Hi guys, so part 2 of the GL Racing GLA all-wheel drive. As you can see, I've done some modifications. So we started off with the kit that I'd got off eBay in the last video, and you could see it came with a Lexan body. As you can see here now, that has been modified. I'll go through this in this video, all the things that I changed to make this car into what we use in our track for racing. So it's more of a drift spec than a racing spec. Now, as you can see, this is a Mini Z auto scale body, which has now been fitted to the shell, and I've also put some lights in, as you can see there. That there is the transponder light, which is actually very useful. The other transponders I have don't have an LED, and you can't always tell they're on, and sometimes that can cause problems during a race if the transponders come loose. But with this car you can actually see, well, this particular make of transponder, which works just fine with our EZZ lap system, so very pleased with that. So I'll get into the car. It's now linked to my Noble Fly Sky radio. I did originally put it with an EX6 ASF receiver, but had a few issues with the steering. It was so sensitive, I had to play around with the settings. I did get it right, but then I decided to just change over to the Fly Sky because I find the Fly Sky easier to use with its menus, and this car has got the space for the receiver, so that's what we did. Okay, onwards to the car. So you might be wondering how I've managed to maintain the brass plate at the bottom and still mount a Mini Z body. Originally I said I was going to change this back to the I think the carbon fibre original shell and chassis plate that you get with it. But this brass plate was so nice, I wanted to keep it because it just looked cool, and it does give the car a kind of a weighting which is nicely balanced. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the car in a second. Actually no, I won't. I might as well show you the all the modifications I had to make. Okay, so I'm just going to disconnect the LED plug. Never easy. Okay, fine. So that's the shell underneath. Now, you've seen this before in the last video. Since then I've added a gyro, as you can see. I've also changed the receiver now to the Fly Sky MB4 receiver, as you can see there. I've got these great plugs from GL Racing, which allow you to convert the servo and the speed controller plugs into regular plugs for your radio. That was pretty cool. Obviously I've got the drift tyres on. These are Mini Z brand drift tyres, front and rear, and these wheels are also the Mini Z offset 0 at the rear and at the front. That's so that it actually will fit the shell just about. It's quite a wide chassis this, so yeah, 0 offset is the only way I could get the Mini Z shell to fit there. If I went for a slightly wider shell, I could probably get away with a 1 or 2 offset at the front and maybe a 1 or 2 offset at the rear. Right, the biggest issue I had with this car, I'm going to get straight to it, was the steering. Now, I did have originally this lovely GL Racing servo, which would have been fine if I'd have noticed straight away that the steering servo was catching the steering arm, the steering servo saver and the arm were catching when I was turning to the left. What that meant was it was putting pressure on the servo, which didn't take much to jam it up, so now it doesn't work properly. I've taken it apart and I can't see why, but let's just turn off the transmitter. Alright, it's okay, it's just warning me. It's great, the Fly Sky warns you if it's not being used for a while. So if I get in closer here, as you can see the servo moving there, I don't know if you can see the servo head. The arm is quite big, it's got a built-in servo saver. So you can see the metal part just there. It's quite large. So this part of the arm was hitting this part when I was turning to the left, and that was limiting steering. Sorry, when the steering servo turns to the left, and that was limiting also steering angle. Right, I'm just going to move the transponder from here because it's blinding. Okay. So guys, yes, I had to make a few alterations to enable the steering angle to be better. So obviously I've towed out the wheels. I've put some washers into the chassis just here so I could raise the steering arms so that when the car turns it doesn't actually hit the servo, which worked perfectly. So now I've got a nice turning angle in both directions. I had to replace the servo that came with the car, the lovely GL Racing one, which had started jamming. With a Jennings servo, which was of the same size. Now, one thing I noticed that would have actually sorted this problem is that this version 2 GLA has a servo mount which goes underneath the servo and elevates the servo. The original mount, the arm goes over the servo sits flat to the chassis. I haven't got that mount, but with that mount it would mean the servo head is lower, and that would mean that these incidents of the servo arms and the links catching wouldn't happen. Anyway, problem solved. So one of the other things I've done here is I put a little Velcro mount on the back. Now I 3D printed this little part that you can see. I'm issues with focus today, guys. And what we've got there is my little solution to the side mounts issue that I would have had. I didn't want to change the breastplate, which I thought was really nice, and I liked the way everything was set up on the chassis. So this means that all I have to do, excuse me, I really insisted on mounting this LED kit because I thought it would look really cool, but sometimes it can be a real hassle. So all I have to do when I'm putting the car together is literally line up the wheels, push it in, and that's it. The Velcro holds it in place, and that's actually pretty good. I raced with that and we had no issues. As you can see, the body is firmly in position, whereas if we use the side mounts here, it is a bit of an issue with these cars. When you're trying to put the shell back on, you usually catch some of the wires. Now the original chassis plate for this is much more narrow and it has side mounts that you can put on, but I probably won't use that now. If anything, I'm going to go back and look at all my other cars of this type, like my AMZs and my BZ3 and my SZ, and see if I can't change this way of mounting, because it is just so much more efficient and easier to take on and off. Okay, so first impressions of the car. I'll put some footage in of it being driven around the circuit. Initially, I was amazed by how smooth the car is. It is very smooth, as smooth as the BZ3, even though this is shaft drive. And the motor response is incredibly linear, and I think that's because this is the censored speed control of the censored motor. I've not driven a censored one before, so I was really impressed with that. I think the weight of the brass plate makes a difference to the kind of racing we do. The circuit isn't that big, and I could see that the car would be faster if it wasn't weighed down by this brass plate. Now I will weigh the car and see what it weighs fully loaded compared to, say, the BZ3, just to give a comparison. I'll do that at the end. But handling wise, it was very predictable, and with the drift wheels on, it actually drifts very nicely. Even without the gyro on, it very easy to control. Now on the race circuit, we have the gyro on for the straights, especially to help us get the power down the straights, otherwise the car will spin out with the drift wheels on the slippy surface. But yeah, overall pretty impressed with the GL. I think it'd be faster. Also, this is a 3,500 kV motor. I've got a 6,500 that I can put. Actually, I think it's a 6,000 I can put in instead, and I think that will probably counteract the fact that it's got the heavier weight. But I will rebuild the car with the normal chassis plate just so I can compare the run times. So I got a good respectable 7.7 seconds around our circuit, and a fast time is about 8 seconds, 8.1. Anything under 9 is good, but 7.7 is really good. When I ran the Mini Z Evo around the track the first time, I got about 7.9, so it's a bit faster than that car. The BZ3 we've now got down to 7.4 seconds, and that car is a beast. That is very fast, and I think still it's the fastest car we've got. But when you're in a race, it's not always the fastest lap that wins, it's the consistency, and both the Mini Z Evo and this car are very easy to drive, whereas the BZ3 is more twitchy, so you have to be on your game with that car. If you are, then you'll win every time. But with these two, you can take a knock and you'll still get round. Okay, so anything else that we changed on the car, obviously apart from the radio system? Obviously I've changed the track width by putting narrow wheels on, but that was more for our circuit. I didn't do much else really. I mean, this car runs pretty beautifully. The biggest issue I had is with the steering, and by all accounts, this steering servo saver is a problem. A few people have mentioned it as well. The only other thing worth mentioning is with the EX6 and the GL Racing Servo, we had a few issues with sensitivity. Otherwise, a big plus. I like this car. Very good, very balanced, very fast. Smooth, easy to drive. Very well put together. I said that in the last video. Very well put together. So let's get on with some drifting, shall we? So guys, time for a comparison between the BZ3 and the GLA version 2. The BZ3, you probably have seen in the previous video that I've done, is the belt drive from Atomic. This is the third version of the belt drive all-wheel drive chassis. You saw my review on it before and I said how smooth the drivetrain is. We've not done anything outside of pretty much what's standard for this car, apart from my little sort of mounting plate that I fitted so I can have the belt area covered. I don't accidentally hit it when I'm putting the Mini Z Shell on. Apart from that, the car is pretty much standard. This car holds the fastest lap on our track, 7.4 seconds, and nothing has got quite close to it yet. I think we've managed 7.6 in one of the others. You could call that close, I suppose, but it's only a small circuit if a car can get around in 7-8 seconds. It's a very predictable, fast car. Predictable in that point to point it moves quickly, but it is twitchy. Now that partly is because it's on a small circuit. The wheelbase I've got set up is a bit narrow. Not the wheelbase so much, the wheel track is narrower. If you were to use this probably on an open circuit, you'd have a much wider track and probably a Lexan Shell. But this car is fast and it handles, but you have to be on your A game to control it. The GL has really impressed me. I think the key to this car is it's very well constructed. This was factory constructed, but you can tell the parts all fit together really nicely. I think it's better constructed than the BZ3 in terms of quality. I thought the quality is very good and the instructions online are very good. It's very smooth. I haven't driven it with a standard brushless motor, but with this censored one, it seems to be very, very, very smooth. I'm very impressed with the smoothness and the predictability of the car. As I mentioned earlier, this has got the brass plate underneath. I think the brass plate element adds an element of predictability to the handling. It makes it very predictable and very easy to control, easier than the BZ3. And I think it's the extra weight that does that. It's a very well balanced car, but the extra weight I think helps stabilize this car. Now obviously I am at some point when I get round to it going to change that brass plate for the standard carbon fibre plate that came with the kit as well. And then I'll see the difference in the handling, but I think it will make it more BZ3 like in handling, and then the cars will become very similar. I think I mentioned earlier on that we got, I think, just say 7.8 seconds or 7.9 seconds around our circuit. with this car. It's very, very fast. It's, you know, it's not slow, but the BZ3 just seems lighter. Now I'm going to do a little weigh-in again. I did a separate video on this for fun, but the one thing I didn't do was do a fully loaded car. So if you look at the BZ3, when you weigh it as a chassis on its own, it's like 123 grams. With the battery, 140. If you pop the shell on that as well, about 174 grams. Okay, so that's the total weight of the car, 174 grams. Now if you try that with the GL, that's 150 just the chassis. 169. Pop the shell on. 207. Okay, so you can see the difference in the weight there, and I think that's what makes a difference to the lap times. I think the cars are very well matched otherwise. Sorry about the camera shake there. And it really comes down to the fact that the BZ3 is way lighter as to why it gets the faster times. And if you watch the laps where they're both running together, you'll see if you clip something with the GL, it kind of doesn't get displaced as easily. Whereas with the BZ3, if you clip something, the car spins out very easily. And that translates into when you're racing, if another car touches you, the BZ3 is easier to knock out of line, whereas the GL, especially with its heavy brass plate and extra 30-40 grams of weight, it doesn't get knocked about. But I think that's what makes a difference to the acceleration. The BZ3 point to point just seems to pick up so much speed, and I think that's where you get the lap times. And certainly you can see in some of the footage, it's behind and then it overtakes just by the fact that it's so much lighter. Now earlier on I did actually weigh the so earlier on in the separate video that I did, I weighed all the cars. I weighed the Mini Z as well. And the Mini Z actually is a respectable 121, 122 when it's unloaded. And even with the shell, it's not that heavy. Where that Mini Z Evo is let down, if I can get all the batteries together, is the power source. Once you add the batteries in, it weighs exactly the same as the GLA, 208, 207. So they both weigh about the same, and their fastest lap times at the moment are about 7.9 seconds for both of them. So you can see a correlation between the weight of the cars and the lap times. Certainly what I think of the cars at the moment is that the GLA is brilliant and easier to put together, and I like the layout of it with this brass plate, chassis plate. I on the whole like the car a lot, aside from the steering issues that I had. I've fixed those steering issues now, but certainly out of the box the BZ3 worked fine. I think I mentioned earlier on about the ride position of the servo, and I think if the servo was flat completely, that would certainly make things easier, and you wouldn't get the bashing of the servo arm against the servo. But as you can see, I've fixed that now by adding these washers here. So in summary, I think it's going to come down to the preference of the type of car that you want. If you like the atomic cars, all the atomic parts, a lot of them are interchangeable, although the BZ3 now has some of the parts that aren't backward compatible, but certainly a lot of the parts you get on the AMZ, and even some of them are compatible with the DRZ. So you've got that compatibility across the board if you want to use your other car's parts. And also obviously the atomic cars have a certain build that they're done a certain way that you'll be familiar with. The GLA is a completely different type of car in terms of all the parts are unique to the GLA, apart from obviously things like wheels and bits and bobs like that. Obviously we run these cars with Mini Z autoscale shells, and the GLA came with a Lexan shell. how much difference does that make? Well, if we weigh the Lexan Shell, let's do that now. Why not? Bear with me a second. So we have the Lexan Shell here. So that weighs about 10 grams. And my Mini Z shell weighs about 38 grams. So there's a big difference there, and that could be enough to compensate for the bass plate. So it comes down to your preferences, really. I think if I was really seeing a difference with the lap times to the point where I think, you know, it's going to make the difference between winning or losing, then I would possibly change the plate on the GLA or use the Lexan Shell. But to be honest, you know, the size of circuit we run, it's the driving that makes more of a difference. Realistically, if you try and compensate for every difference between the cars, you might as well just run stock cars. Part of the fun, it really is racing the different types of cars together and just seeing how they perform differently and how we change our race lines according to the style of the car. So for example, the BZ3, because it's lighter, you can brake later and come in really tight on the apex, and you're kind of drifting less with it more than just skidding it around the corner. Whereas the GLA, with this kind of weighting, you are more sliding it around the corner, but it's really satisfying to drive. So I think what it comes down to is your personal preferences. The GLA and the Mini Z both weigh the same fully loaded Mini Z Evo. They have, you know, compatible drivetrains. They're both shaft driven, and in this particular case they're both factory constructed, but they couldn't be more opposite. If you're going to race on a big open circuit at a club, I think realistically it's going to be the BZ3 that's going to win because it's light. I think I'd have to do a speed test and see how the cars handle with grip tyres on a big open flat surface, and that is something I'm trying to organise at the moment. And I think I'll do another video where they're both let loose with wider tracks and see what top speeds do to the cars and how they handle and how they respond. So the rest really is up to the individual. Bearing in mind I am running the BZ3 with a radio link RC4GS, which is brilliant. I did have to switch from my EX6 to my Noble FlySky for the GL. There were some issues with the steering setup. Someone else pointed this out to me as well. They mentioned that they were having difficulty with the sensitivity, and the moment I took the car onto the track, I had a similar problem with the EX6, and I had to turn the steering response down. It was so sensitive, and the steering return as well. It did work eventually, but I think as I had a spare receiver for my FlySky and this car had the perfect spot to put it in, I couldn't resist to try it out, and it worked beautifully. Okay guys, so I'm going to leave you with some footage now of the cars going around the circuit. See what you think, likes, subscribe and comments, and I'll catch you next time.